The money problem. Around that time, there was a big public demand to print more paper money. There was only about 15,000 pounds in circulation in the province, and even that was scheduled to be pulled soon. The rich folks were against printing any more. They hated all paper currency because they were afraid it would lose its value, just like it had in New England, which would be bad for anyone who was owed money. We debated this in my club, the Junto, and I was all for printing more. I was convinced that the small batch we printed back in 1723 had done a lot of good. It had boosted trade, created jobs, and brought more people to the province. I could see it with my own eyes. All the old houses were now occupied, and new ones were being built everywhere. I clearly remembered when I first arrived in Philadelphia, walking down the street eating a bread roll and seeing "For Rent" signs on most of the houses on Walnut Street, between 2nd and Front. It was the same on Chestnut and other streets, which made me think people were abandoning the city. I got so into the topic from our debates that I wrote and published an anonymous pamphlet about it. Regular people generally loved it, but the rich guys hated it because it fired up the public demand for more money even more. And since they didn't have any writers on their side who could argue against it, their opposition just fizzled out and the proposal passed in the government. My friends in the House, who figured I had helped the cause, decided to reward me by hiring me to print the money. It was a really well-paying job and a huge help to me. This was another win that came from being able to write. Over time, it became obvious that this new currency was a good thing, and nobody really argued against it anymore. The amount in circulation soon grew to 55,000 pounds, and by 1739 it was up to 80,000. During the war, it went as high as 350,000 pounds, and all the while, trade, construction, and the population kept growing. Though, looking back, I now think there are limits, and printing too much can be harmful. Soon after, my friend Hamilton helped me get the contract to print paper money for Newcastle, another sweet gig. When you don't have much, little things seem like a big deal. And for me, these jobs were huge advantages and great encouragement. He also got me the job of printing the laws and government records, which I kept for as long as I was in the business. I then opened a small stationery shop. I sold all kinds of blank forms, and they were the most accurate ones around, thanks to help from my friend Branknell. I also sold paper, parchment, cheap books, and other supplies. A guy named Whitemash, a skilled typesetter I knew from London, came to work for me and was a steady, hard worker. I also took on an apprentice, the son of a Quail Rose. I was still in debt for the printing press. To build my reputation and credit as a businessman, I was careful not only to be hard-working and frugal, but also to avoid even the appearance of being lazy or wasteful. I dressed simply. You'd never see me at parties or wasting time. I never went fishing or hunting. Okay, I admit, sometimes I'd get lost in a book and neglect my work, but that was rare. I did it privately, and it didn't cause any gossip. And to show I wasn't above my work, I sometimes pushed the paper I bought from the store through the streets in a wheelbarrow. Because people saw me as a hard-working, successful young guy who paid his bills on time, the merchants who imported stationery wanted my business. Others offered to supply me with books, and things were going great. Meanwhile, my old boss Keimer's business and reputation were going down the tubes. He was eventually forced to sell his print shop to pay off his debts. He moved to Barbados and lived there for a few years in poverty. His apprentice, David Harry, whom I had trained, took his place in Philadelphia after buying his equipment. At first, I was worried Harry would be a tough competitor, since his friends were powerful and had a lot of influence. So I offered to partner with him, but luckily for me, he arrogantly turned me down. He was a very proud guy who dressed like a gentleman, spent a lot of money, partied all the time, got into debt, and ignored his business. So naturally, his business left him. When he couldn't find any work, he followed Keimer to Barbados, taking the printing equipment with him. There, the apprentice hired his old boss as an employee. They fought often, Harry fell deeper into debt, and eventually he had to sell his printing type and go back to being a farmhand in Pennsylvania. The person who bought the equipment hired Keimer to use it, but he died a few years later. At this point, my only real competitor left in Philadelphia was the old guy, Bradford. He was rich and comfortable and did a little printing here and there with temporary workers, but he didn't really care much about the business. However, since he ran the post office, people figured he got the best news. His newspaper was considered a better place for ads than mine, so he got a lot more of them, which was good for him and bad for me. Even though I was able to send and receive newspapers through the mail, the public didn't think so because I had to bribe the mail carriers to take my papers on the sly. Bradford was enough of a jerk to forbid them from carrying my stuff, which made me pretty resentful. I thought it was such a petty move that when I later got his job, I made sure never to do the same thing. All this time, I had been boarding with a man named Godfrey. He lived in part of my house with his wife and kids and used one side of my shop for his glass-cutting business, though he didn't work much as he was always obsessed with math. Mrs. Godfrey tried to set me up with a relative's daughter. She kept finding excuses to bring us together until I started seriously courting her. The guard was very nice, and her parents encouraged me with constant dinner invitations, often leaving us alone together. Eventually, it was time to talk terms. Mrs. Godfrey acted as our go-between. I let her know that I expected a dowry big enough to pay off the rest of my debt for the printing press, which I think was about £100 at the time. She came back and said they didn't have that kind of cash. I suggested they could mortgage their house. A few days later, the answer came back. They didn't approve of the match. Apparently, they had asked Bradford, who told them that the printing business wasn't profitable, the equipment would wear out, and that since Keimer and Harry had both failed, I would probably be next. So I was forbidden from coming to their house, and they basically put their daughter on lockdown. I don't know if they really changed their minds, or if it was just a trick, assuming we were too in love to back out and would elope, which would let them decide later if they wanted to give us any money. I suspected it was a trick, was pissed off about it, and stopped going over there. Mrs. Godfrey later tried to tell me they were warming up to the idea again, and tried to pull me back in, but I told her I was completely done with that family. This offended the Godfreys. We had a falling out, and they moved out, leaving me with the whole house. I decided then not to take on any more tenants. Finding a partner. But this whole thing got me thinking about getting married. I started looking around and meeting people, but I quickly realized that since printing was considered a poor man's job, I couldn't expect to marry a woman with a dowry unless she was someone I wasn't really into otherwise. All this time, I had stayed friendly with Mrs. Reed and her family, my first landlords. They had always liked me, and they often invited me over and asked for my advice on their problems, which I was sometimes able to help with. I felt bad for poor Miss Reed's unfortunate situation. She was usually depressed, rarely happy, and avoided people. I realized that my flaky and irresponsible behavior back in London was a big reason she was so unhappy now. Her mother was kind enough to blame herself more than me, since she had been the one to stop us from marrying before I left and had pushed her into another marriage while I was gone. Our old feelings for each other came back, but now there were huge obstacles to us getting married. Her marriage was considered invalid because her husband was rumored to have another wife still living in England, but that was hard to prove since it was so far away. And even though there was a rumor he had died, no one knew for sure. On top of that, even if he was dead, he had left behind a lot of debts that his new wife's husband could be forced to pay. Despite all these problems, we decided to take the risk, and I married her on September 1st, 1730. None of the bad things we worried about ever happened. She turned out to be a good and faithful partner who helped me a lot by running the shop. We succeeded together and always tried to make each other happy. That's how I fixed that huge mistake as best as I could. Around this time, my club had started meeting in a small private room at Mr. Grace's place instead of a bar. I made a proposal. Since we were always referring to books in our discussions, it would be handy to have them all in one place where we met. By pooling our books into a shared library, each of us could use everyone else's books, which would be almost as good as each of us owning the entire collection. Everyone liked the idea, and we filled one end of the room with books we could spare. We didn't get as many as we expected, and while the collection was useful, some books got lost or damaged because no one was properly taking care of them. After about a year, we gave up, separated the collection, and everyone took their books home. And that's when I started my first real public project, a subscription library. I drew up the proposals, had a top legal scribe, Brockton, write them up officially, and with the help of my friends in the Junto, I got 50 people to subscribe. They each paid 40 shillings upfront, and then 10 shillings a year for the next 50 years, which was how long our group was supposed to last. We later got an official charter and grew to 100 members. This was the mother of all subscription libraries in North America, which are now everywhere. It's become a major institution in its own right and is still growing. These libraries have elevated the level of conversation among Americans and have made average tradesmen and farmers as knowledgeable as most gentlemen from other countries. They may have even played a part in the widespread stand the colonies took to defend their rights. Everything up to this point was written with my family in mind and includes personal stories that aren't important to anyone else. What follows was written many years later based on advice I received in some letters and is therefore intended for the public. The American Revolution caused the long interruption. I'm not sure if I already told the story of how I started the Philadelphia Public Library, but I think I left off right around that time, 1730. So I'll start there, and if it's a repeat, it can just be deleted later. When I first set up my business in Pennsylvania, there wasn't a single good bookstore in any of the colonies south of Boston. In New York and Philadelphia, the printers also acted as stationers, but they only sold paper, almanacs, song sheets, and a few basic school books. People who loved to read had to order their books from England. The members of my club, the Junto, each owned a few. We had stopped meeting at the tavern and rented a room for our club. I proposed that we all bring our books to that room. That way, we could easily consult them during our discussions, and everyone could benefit by borrowing any book they wanted to read at home. We did this, and it worked for a while. Seeing how useful this small collection was, I decided to make books more accessible to everyone by starting a public subscription library. I sketched out a plan and the rules, and had a skilled lawyer, Mr. Charles Brockton, draw up the official articles of agreement. Each subscriber had to pay a certain amount up front to buy the first set of books, and then an annual fee to buy more. There were so few readers in Philadelphia back then, and most of us were so poor, that even with a lot of effort, I could only find 50 people, mostly young tradesmen, willing to pay 40 shillings up front and 10 shillings a year. We started with that small fund. The books were imported from England, and the library opened one day a week for subscribers to borrow them, on the condition they sign a note promising to pay double the book's value if they didn't return it. The library quickly proved its worth and was copied in other towns and provinces. The collections grew with donations, reading became fashionable, and since our people had no public entertainment to distract them, they became more familiar with books. Within a few years, visitors noted that Americans were better educated and more intelligent than people of the same social rank in other countries. When we were about to sign the articles, which were legally binding for 50 years, Mr. Brockton, the lawyer, told us, "You are all young men, but it's unlikely any of you will live to see the end of this agreement." As it turns out, a number of us are still alive today. But the original agreement became obsolete after a few years, when we got a charter that incorporated the library and made it permanent. A lesson in humility. The objections and pushback I got while trying to get subscriptions taught me a valuable lesson. It's a bad idea to present yourself as the sole creator of a useful project. People get jealous if they think it will make you look better than them, especially when you need their help to get it done. So, I made sure to stay in the background as much as possible. I presented it as a plan from a number of friends who had asked me to propose it to people who loved reading. By doing this, things went much more smoothly. I've used this strategy ever since, and it's worked so well that I can wholeheartedly recommend it. The small sacrifice to your ego now will be paid back in full later. If it's unclear for a while who deserves the credit, some show-off will eventually try to claim it, and then even your haters will step in to set the record straight and give you the credit you deserve.
This library gave me the chance to constantly improve myself through study, for which I set aside an hour or two every day. This helped make up for the formal education my father had once planned for me. Reading was the only hobby I allowed myself. I wasted no time in taverns, on games, or on any kind of fooling around. I continued to work as hard as I possibly could in my business, because I had to. I was still in debt for my printing press. I had a young family to raise and educate, and I had to compete with 2 other printers who were already established. But slowly, my financial situation got easier. I stuck to my frugal habits. My father had often repeated a proverb from Solomon to me as a boy. "Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will serve before kings. He will not serve before obscure men." From that, I always saw hard work as the way to get wealthy and respected, which motivated me, though I never thought I would literally stand before kings. But it actually happened. I have stood before 5 kings, and even had the honor of sitting down to dinner with one, the King of Denmark. We have an English proverb that says, "He that would thrive must ask his wife." I was lucky that I had a wife who was just as hard-working and frugal as I was. She cheerfully helped me with the business by folding and stitching pamphlets, running the shop, and buying old linen rags for the papermakers. We didn't have any lazy servants. Our meals were plain and simple, and our furniture was the cheapest we could find. For example, for a long time my breakfast was just bread and milk, no tea, and I ate it out of a 2-penny clay bowl with a pewter spoon. But it's funny how luxury sneaks into a family, no matter your principles. One morning I was called to breakfast and found it served in a china bowl with a silver spoon. My wife had bought them for me without my knowledge. They had cost her the enormous sum of 23 shillings. Her only excuse was that she felt her husband deserved a silver spoon and a china bowl just as much as any of the neighbors did. This was the first time we had any silver or china in our house. Over the years, as we got wealthier, our collection gradually grew to be worth several £100s.
On religion. I was raised as a strict Presbyterian, but some of their doctrines, like the eternal decrees of God, election, and reprobation, made no sense to me, while others seemed questionable. I stopped going to church pretty early on, since Sunday was my day for studying, but I always held on to some core religious principles. For example, I never doubted that God exists, that He created the world and governs it, that the best way to serve God is to do good for other people, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded, either here or in the afterlife. I considered these to be the essentials of any religion. Since you could find them in all the religions in our country, I respected them all, though some more than others, depending on how mixed up they were with other ideas that did nothing to encourage morality and mainly served to divide people and make us hostile to one another. Because I respected all faiths and believed even the worst ones had some good effects, I avoided any conversation that might make someone think less of their own religion. And as our province grew and new churches were constantly being built by voluntary donations, I always gave my small contribution, no matter the denomination. Even though I rarely went to any public worship, I still believed it was a proper and useful thing when done right, and I regularly paid my annual dues to support the only Presbyterian minister in Philadelphia. He would sometimes visit me as a friend and urge me to attend his services, and I was occasionally convinced to go, one time for 5 Sundays in a row. If he had been a good preacher, in my opinion, I might have kept going, despite needing my Sundays for studying. But his sermons were mostly either argumentative debates or explanations of our sect's peculiar doctrines. I found them all very dry, uninteresting, and uninspiring, since not a single moral principle was ever taught or reinforced. The goal seemed to be to make us good Presbyterians rather than good citizens. Finally, he chose a text from Philippians. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. I thought with a text like that we were guaranteed to get some moral lessons, but he limited himself to only 5 points. 1. Keeping the Sabbath day holy. 2. Diligently reading the Scriptures. 3. Attending church. 4. Taking communion. 5. Paying proper respect to God's ministers. Those might all be good things, but they weren't the kind of good things I expected from that text. I gave up hope of ever hearing what I wanted to hear from him, got disgusted, and never went to his sermons again. Years before, in 1728, I had written a little prayer book for my own private use. I went back to using that and stopped going to public services. My behavior might have been wrong, but I'll leave it at that without trying to make excuses, because my goal here is to state the facts, not to apologize for them.